Most people imagine Capernaum as a grand city, an urban center worthy of receiving the man who would change the history of humanity. The truth is something else entirely. What existed there was a fishing village of roughly 1,500 souls, houses of dark, unplastered basalt and dirt streets that never reached 3 meters in width. This is the story no one told you. Put into perspective what it meant to live on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Lake of Gennesaret, in the year 30 of the Common Era. The lake stretched 21 kilometers from north to south and 13 kilometers from east to west, reaching a maximum depth of 43 meters. Its fresh water sustained at least 18 species of fish, the most important of which was the Galilean tilapia, known today as St. Peter's fish. It was this lake that determined absolutely everything about life in Capernaum. The hour men woke, what families ate, how much money circulated, who prospered and who went hungry. The village did not exist in spite of the lake. The village existed because of it. Capernaum sat on the northwestern shore, at an altitude of 210 meters below sea level. This geographical position created a phenomenon that shaped the life of every resident. The heat was brutal. In summer, temperatures surpassed 40 degrees Celsius with ease, and the humidity rising off the lake turned the air into something almost tangible, dense, clinging. In winter, violent winds descended from the Golan Heights to the east and the hills of Galilee to the west, funneled through the Jordan Valley like air through a natural chimney. These winds struck the lake without warning and generated waves 2 to 3 meters high in a matter of minutes. Mark chapter 4, verses 37 through 39, records exactly one of these sudden storms, the moment when the disciples themselves, experienced fishermen who had spent their entire lives on those waters, fell into panic. It was not theater, it was real survival. Consider the physical structure of that village. Archaeological excavations conducted since 1905, initially by Franciscans and later expanded by international teams beginning in 1968, revealed that Capernaum occupied an area of approximately 6 hectares. To put that in scale, it amounts to just over 6 football pitches. An entire village with all its houses, alleyways, synagogues, storehouses, and work areas fit inside 6 football pitches. The population estimated by archaeologists Virgilio Corbo and Stanislaw Lofreda ranged between 1,000 and 1,500 people. Some more generous estimates reach 2,000, but none exceed that number. The houses followed a pattern called the insula, a cluster of rooms built around an open central courtyard. Each insula housed not a single family, but an entire clan. Grandparents, parents, children, uncles, cousins, all sharing the same space. A single insula could contain 4 to 6 rooms, each between 9 and 15 square meters. The rooms had no windows. The only source of light came through the door, which opened onto the inner courtyard. Note the direct consequence of this. The interiors of these houses were permanently dark, hot, and poorly ventilated. The smell of dried fish, rancid olive oil, and human sweat accumulated in the black basalt walls, which absorbed the sun's heat through the day and radiated it back through the night. The rooftops were the most revealing feature of all. There was no sophisticated engineering involved. The covering was made of wooden beams, usually sycamore or olive wood, layered with interwoven branches, straw mats, and a compacted mixture of mud and clay. This kind of roof had to be remade every rainy season. And this is precisely the kind of roof that Mark, chapter 2, verse 4, describes being opened by 4 men to lower a paralytic down to Jesus. It was not an act of structural vandalism. It was entirely feasible to dismantle that covering by hand, because it was nothing more than mud, straw, and branches. The detail matters. It reveals the material fragility of that world. The synagogue of Capernaum is one of the most debated archaeological finds in the region. The ruins visible today belong to a white limestone synagogue dated to the 4th or 5th century. But beneath it, archaeologists found the basalt foundations of an earlier structure dated to the 1st century. That lower structure measured approximately 24 meters in length by 18 meters in width. On the scale of Capernaum, it was the most imposing building in the entire village. Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, records that this synagogue was built by a Roman centurion who held affection for the Jewish people. A Roman military officer, a representative of the occupying power, financing the construction of a Jewish place of worship. The paradox was a daily feature of life in that village. Follow the rhythm of daily life. The day began before dawn, around 4:30 in the morning. The fishermen were already on the lake or returning from it. Night fishing was the most productive because the Galilean tilapia feeds in shallow waters during the night and migrates to greater depths during the day. A typical fishing crew operated with 4 to 5 men in a wooden boat, roughly 8 meters in length and 2.5 meters in width. We know these measurements precisely because in 1986, during a severe drought that lowered the lake's level, a 1st-century boat was discovered preserved in the mud. The so-called Jesus boat, found near Kibbutz Ginosar, just a few kilometers from Capernaum, measured 8 meters and 2 centimeters in length, 2 meters and 35 centimeters in width, and 1 meter and 25 centimeters in depth. It was built from 12 different types of wood, indicating that its builders used whatever material was available. Repairs upon repairs, survival economics. Each such boat cost the equivalent of a family's sustenance for several years. It was not individual property, it was the patrimony of an entire clan. When Peter and Andrew, in Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 20, left their nets to follow Jesus, they were not simply changing professions. They were placing the entire economic structure of their extended family at risk. When James and Zebedee, in the following verse, left the boat and their father, the text records that Zebedee remained in the boat with the hired men. The presence of hired workers indicates that Zebedee's family was relatively more prosperous than average. But even so, the departure of both sons represented a loss of labor that would be difficult to replace. The economy was merciless. The fishing nets came in 3 main types. The dragnet, called the sagine in Greek, could measure up to 100 meters in length and required 2 vessels operating in tandem. The cast net, known as the amphibolstron, was thrown by a single fisherman standing on the shore or the bow of a boat, weighed between 10 and 15 kilograms, and demanded precise technique to launch properly. And the gill net, called the diction, was stretched vertically through the water and functioned like an invisible wall that caught fish by their gills. Each type required constant maintenance. Fishermen spent hours every day sewing, washing, and drying their nets. Mark chapter 1, verse 19, finds James and John not fishing but mending nets. That everyday detail reveals that maintenance consumed nearly as much time as fishing itself. Witness the moment the boats returned at dawn. Fresh fish had to be processed immediately. There was no refrigeration. Under the heat of that submerged valley, 210 meters below sea level, a fish began to deteriorate within hours. Processing involved 3 possible destinies. Some was sold fresh in local markets and in nearby towns like Magdala, just 6 kilometers to the south. Some was salted and dried in the sun, creating a preserved product that could last weeks and be transported over long distances. And some was transformed into garum, a fermented fish sauce that was one of the most valuable commodities in the Roman world. Garum deserves attention. This paste, made from fish entrails fermented with coarse salt in open tanks under the sun for weeks, produced an odor so intense that Roman law prohibited its production within city limits. But the finished product was sought across the entire empire. Magdala, Capernaum's neighbor, had its own Greek name, Tarichiae, derived from tarikos, meaning salted fish. The entire region was known for its fishing industry. The fish processing tanks uncovered in the excavations at Magdala confirm an operation on a nearly industrial scale, and Capernaum was at the heart of all of it. Examine the details of daily nourishment. The diet in Capernaum was monotonous and limited. Fish was the primary protein, consumed fresh, dried, or in the form of garum. Bread was made from barley for the poorest and from wheat for those who could afford it. Lentils, fava beans, onions, garlic, and cucumbers rounded out the meals. Olive oil was omnipresent, used for cooking, for lighting, for hygiene, and even as medicine. Wine was consumed daily, almost always diluted with water at a ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Red meat was an absolute rarity. A lamb appeared on the table only at religious festivals, especially Passover. For the vast majority of Capernaum's residents, beef or goat was an inaccessible luxury. The average caloric intake of a manual laborer in first-century Palestine was estimated between 1,800 and 2,200 calories per day. For a fisherman performing strenuous physical labor over 6 to 8 hours every night, that caloric level was chronically insufficient. Analysis of bones found in Galilean necropolises reveals frequent signs of anemia, calcium deficiency, and early joint deterioration. Average life expectancy was 35 to 40 years. Half of all children did not survive to age 5. Weigh those numbers. In a village of 1,500 people, approximately 300 were children under 10 years of age. Of those, somewhere between 120 and 150 would die before reaching adulthood. Every family experienced the loss of children as a normal feature of existence. The causes were predictable and relentless: gastrointestinal infections from contaminated water, untreated fevers, intestinal parasites, chronic malnutrition that weakened the immune system to the point where any minor infection became fatal. Water was a central problem. Capernaum had no significant natural spring of its own. Water came from the lake, which received sewage, fish processing waste, and animal refuse. There was no filtration system. Cisterns stored rainwater. But the dry season lasted from May to October, 5 to 6 months without significant rainfall. During that period, dependence on lake water was total. Waterborne diseases, especially dysentery and parasitic infections, were not seasonal. They were permanent. Calculate the magnitude of the tax system that crushed that population. Capernaum occupied a strategic position on the Via Maris, the ancient trade route linking Egypt to Damascus and Mesopotamia. This made it a point of fiscal collection. Matthew chapter 9 verse 9 records Jesus finding Levi, also called Matthew, sitting at the tax collector's booth. It was not a coincidence. It was geography. The tax system had multiple layers. The direct Roman tax, the tributum, levied a percentage on land and on production. The indirect tax, the portorium, was collected on goods in transit at border and crossing points. Capernaum, positioned on the boundary between the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas and that of Philip, was precisely one of those points. Beyond the Roman taxes, there was the religious tithe to the temple, the half-shekel temple maintenance tax, and additional seasonal contributions. Historians such as Gildas Hamel estimate that the combined tax burden consumed between 35 and 45% of a family's total output. This explains the visceral hatred toward tax collectors. Publicans were not simple functionaries. They were Jews who purchased the right to collect taxes from the Romans and profited by collecting above the official rate. Everything exceeding the Roman quota went to the publican. The system incentivized extortion. When the Gospels place tax collectors and sinners in the same category, they are reflecting real social perception, not constructing a theological metaphor. For the fisherman of Capernaum, the publican was the neighbor who profited from the misery of his own people. And that is precisely the kind of man Jesus called to be his disciple. Now consider what the Roman presence meant in that region. Capernaum had no significant permanent military garrison, but the presence of a centurion is recorded in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13, and in Luke chapter 7. A centurion commanded 80 to 100 soldiers. Archaeology has found no evidence of a Roman barracks in Capernaum, suggesting that the military presence was more administrative than combative. But the mere existence of Roman soldiers walking among the houses of Jewish fishermen created a permanent and silent tension. The centurion of Capernaum is a fascinating figure precisely because he breaks every stereotype. Luke records that he loved the Jewish nation and had built their synagogue. A Roman officer, representative of the occupying power, financing the religious life of the occupied. This happened. The ancient world did not fit into simple categories. There were Romans who admired Jewish culture, just as there were Jews who collaborated with Rome. The lines between oppressor and oppressed blurred in the daily life of a village where everyone knew everyone else. Observe the scene inside the houses at the end of the day. Lighting came from olive oil lamps, small ceramic vessels with a wick spout. Each lamp produced a brightness equivalent to a single modern candle. A whole house might have 2 or 3 of these lamps. The darkness was nearly total. Families gathered in the inner courtyard at nightfall, ate the main meal of the day sitting on the ground on straw mats, and went to sleep early. There was no furniture as we know it. There were no raised beds for the poor. They slept on mats on floors of packed earth or stone, covered with cloaks that also served as outer garments during the day. Exodus chapter 22, verses 26 and 27, records the law prohibiting the retention of a debtor's cloak after sunset, precisely because that cloak was also his blanket. A piece of clothing was a luxury. A common man owned 2 sets of garments. The inner tunic, the chitonet, made of linen or wool, and the outer cloak, the simla, heavier and more durable. Luke chapter 3, verse 11 records John the Baptist instructing anyone with 2 tunics to give one to whoever had none. The instruction sounds simple. In practice, it meant surrendering half of your entire wardrobe. The women of Capernaum carried a disproportionate burden. They woke before the men. They prepared the bread dough, grinding grain on basalt millstones that weighed between 15 and 40 kilograms. The daily grinding required to feed a family of 6 to 8 people consumed between 1 and 2 hours of continuous physical labor. Then they lit the clay ovens in the common courtyard of the insula. They fetched water, washed clothes at the lake, tended children, processed fish, made and mended clothing. The excavations at Capernaum found dozens of basalt millstones in nearly every insula, confirming that this activity was daily and universal. Peter's mother-in-law lived in that village. Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 and 15, records Jesus entering Peter's house and finding his mother-in-law in bed with a fever. The house, identified by tradition as Peter's house, has been extensively excavated. It was a typical insula with several rooms around a central courtyard, with no architectural distinction that set it apart from any other. The apostle, who would be called the rock upon which the church would be built, lived in a house indistinguishable from all the rest. No decoration, no worked flooring, no plaster on the walls. This was Jesus' base of operations. Matthew chapter 4, verse 13 records that Jesus left Nazareth and went to live in Capernaum. The Greek verb used is katoikesin, meaning he established residence, not merely visited. Jesus did not use Capernaum as a stopping point. He chose it as home. And the question the biblical text does not answer directly, but which geography answers with clarity, is why. Capernaum sat at the intersection of routes. The Via Maris passed through it. Fishermen from the entire northern shore converged on that point. Merchants in transit between the tetrarchies stopped there. Tax collectors operated there. Roman soldiers moved through there. It was a point of human convergence entirely disproportionate to its size. Jesus did not choose Jerusalem, with its 250,000 inhabitants and its priestly elite. He did not choose Sepphoris, the Galilean capital rebuilt by Herod Antipas just 6 kilometers from Nazareth, with its theater seating 4,000 and its mosaic paved streets. He chose a fishing village with dark houses and dirt roads. The choice was the message. Follow what took place inside the synagogue. The Sabbath service began in the morning with the recitation of the Shema Israel, followed by standardized prayers, the reading of the Torah in Hebrew with simultaneous translation into Aramaic, the reading of the prophets, and a sermon or commentary. Any adult Jewish male could be invited to read and comment on the scriptures. There was no professional clergy in the synagogues of Galilee. The Hazan, responsible for the synagogue, handled maintenance, kept the sacred scrolls, and organized the service. But he was not a priest. Luke, chapter 4, verses 16 through 30, describes Jesus reading from Isaiah in the synagogue of Nazareth with complete naturalness. Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, records that in Capernaum he taught as one who had authority and not as the scribes. The difference was perceptible. The scribes cited earlier rabbis as their source of authority. Jesus spoke in his own name. The synagogue was not only a religious space, it was a courthouse, a school, a hostel, and a community center. Disputes between neighbors were resolved there. Children learned to read the sacred texts there. Travelers could spend the night there. All of communal life orbited that basalt building, and it was in that space that most of the miracles recorded in Capernaum took place. Mark, chapter 1, verses 23 through 28, records the expulsion of an unclean spirit in the synagogue. Mark, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, records the healing of the paralytic lowered through the roof. John, chapter 6, verses 59 through 71, records the discourse on the bread of life that scandalized many followers. Capernaum was not a passive backdrop. It was the stage on which the greatest controversies of Jesus' ministry unfolded. Examine the economic impact of Jesus' presence in the village. Mark, chapter 2, verse 2 records that so many people gathered that there was no longer room even in front of the door. For a village of 1,500 people, the sudden arrival of hundreds or even thousands coming from all of Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and from beyond the Jordan, as Mark chapter 3 verse 8 records, represented an enormous logistical strain. Where these people slept, what they ate, who fed them. The text does not answer these questions, but archaeology shows that Capernaum had no infrastructure to absorb crowds. There were no inns. There was no permanent market with the capacity to feed thousands. The pressure on local resources was inevitable. Consider now the Sabbath and how thoroughly it governed life in Capernaum. From sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, all work ceased. No fishing, no cooking, no walking beyond 2,000 cubits, approximately 900 meters. The Sabbath food was prepared entirely on Friday. The ovens were extinguished. The nets lay spread out. The boats remained at anchor, in a subsistence economy where every day without work meant less food in the week ahead. The Sabbath was simultaneously an act of radical faith and a luxury the poorest could barely afford. But everyone observed it. The social and religious pressure was absolute, and it was precisely over the Sabbath that Jesus would provoke the greatest tensions in Capernaum. Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28, records the controversy over the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, records the healing of a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath inside the synagogue in front of the Pharisees. These were not abstract theological debates. They were public confrontations inside a village where everyone knew everyone, where every face had a name, where the social consequences were immediate and personal. Witness the lake at dusk, when the surface of the water reflected the Golan Hills in tones of copper and violet. The fishing boats began to push out for the night's work. The sound of nets being unrolled mingled with the lowing of the few animals families kept in their courtyards. Goats, mainly, which provided milk and occasionally meat. Some chickens, perhaps a donkey for transport. The smell of smoked fish permeated the entire village. There was no escaping it. The processing fires burned for hours, and the smoke, heavy with animal fat, worked its way into clothes, into hair, into the basalt walls. You would know you were approaching Capernaum before you saw it. The smell arrived first. Skin diseases were epidemic. The combination of intense sun exposure, constant contact with lake water, handling of raw fish, and poor hygiene produced chronic dermatological conditions. The leprosy mentioned repeatedly in the Gospels covered a broad spectrum of skin diseases, not only Hansen's disease. Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 details an elaborate system of diagnosis and quarantine conducted by priests who functioned as sanitary inspectors. A diagnosis of impurity meant complete social exclusion. The afflicted person was expelled from the community, forbidden from entering the synagogue, required to cry out "unclean" whenever anyone approached. In a village of 1,500 people, where the survival network was collective, exclusion amounted to a slow and silent sentence. When Jesus touched a leper, as Mark chapter 1 verses 40 through 45 records, he was not merely performing a therapeutic act. He was breaking the most fundamental barrier of that society. Touch was the supreme taboo, and he did it deliberately, publicly, repeatedly. Death was a constant neighbor in Capernaum. The necropolises lay outside the village limits, to the east and north, as Jewish law required. The dead were washed, anointed with aromatic oils, and wrapped in linen strips. Burial took place on the same day as death, a practical requirement in a climate where decomposition began within hours. The formal mourning period lasted 7 days, and called Shiva, during which the family received visitors and did not work. For a family of fishermen, 7 days without fishing meant 7 days without income. Death was expensive even for the living. Rock-hewn tombs, like that of Joseph of Arimathea mentioned in the Gospels, were a privilege of the wealthy. The poor of Capernaum were buried in simple graves directly in the soil, often without a covering slab. Archaeology confirms this. The more elaborate tombs of the region are concentrated in Jerusalem and the larger cities. In rural Galilee, simplicity prevailed even in death. Measure the contrast between Capernaum and the cities Jesus avoided. Sepphoris, 6 kilometers from Nazareth, had a Roman theater, colonnaded streets, refined mosaics, and an estimated population of 8,000 to 12,000 inhabitants. Tiberias, founded by Herod Antipas between the years 18 and 20 on the southwestern shore of the lake, just 15 kilometers from Capernaum, was a planned city with a palace, a stadium, Roman baths, and sophisticated infrastructure. The Gospels record no visit by Jesus to Tiberias, not one. The most modern and cosmopolitan city in Galilee, built during Jesus' adult lifetime, almost visible from the shores of Capernaum on clear days, simply does not appear in the Gospel narrative. The absence speaks as loudly as the presence. Jesus operated among fishermen, not philosophers, among tax collectors, not magistrates, among excluded sick, not healthy priests. The choice of Capernaum as a base was not accidental, nor merely pragmatic. It was programmatic. It revealed the entire direction of the movement. follow the arc of a typical day for Peter during that period. Departure for the lake at nightfall. 6 to 8 hours of heavy physical labor, throwing nets that weighed over 10 kilograms when wet, hauling them back loaded with fish, repeating the process dozens of times, return at dawn, unloading the catch, sorting by species and size, immediate sale of the fresh fish, salting the surplus, washing and mending the nets, and then, instead of sleeping, following Jesus through the neighboring villages, listening to his teachings, witnessing healings, facing confrontations with Pharisees and scribes. The physical exhaustion was cumulative and relentless. Peter was not young when he was called. The mention of his mother-in-law indicates he was married. Tradition suggests he had children. He was a middle-aged man with family responsibilities, a business to manage, and a body already marked by years of hard labor. And even so, he left everything. The decision makes no economic sense. It makes no social sense. It makes no sense by any logic of survival that governed life in Capernaum. And that is precisely why it is so revealing. Something in that encounter on the lakeshore surpassed every rational calculation a Galilean fisherman knew how to make. But Capernaum was also the place of rejection. Matthew chapter 11, verses 23 and 24. Records harsh words from Jesus against the very city that had received him. The text states that if the miracles performed there had been performed in Sodom, Sodom would have remained to that day. The condemnation is more severe than any directed at any other city in the Gospels, more severe than the condemnation of Tyre, more severe than that of Sidon. The city that had seen the most, received the most, witnessed the most, was the most harshly warned, and history confirmed the warning. Capernaum declined slowly after the 1st century. In the Byzantine period, between the 4th and 7th centuries, the village experienced a brief renaissance as a site of Christian pilgrimage. The white limestone synagogue was built during that period. An octagonal church was raised over what tradition identified as Peter's house, but the prosperity did not last. After the Arab conquest in the 7th century, Capernaum was gradually abandoned. By the 10th century, no one remained. The village Jesus had chosen as home became ruins, and then became silence. Absolute silence. For centuries, no one could even say with certainty where Capernaum had been. Its location was only definitively confirmed in the 19th century, when American explorer Edward Robinson and later British surveyor Charles Wilson identified the ruins of Tel Hum as the site of ancient Capernaum. Systematic excavations began in 1905 and continue to this day, more than 120 years later, still uncovering details about the daily life of that village. Today, the visitor who walks among the ruins finds the basalt walls of the insula exposed to the sun, the courtyards where entire families cooked, slept, and mourned their dead. The basalt millstones sit where they were found. The remains of the stone quay where boats once docked are still visible when the lake level falls. The white synagogue rises above the dark foundations of the synagogue Jesus knew. The layers overlap like pages of a book no one has finished reading. Think about what those 1,500 people did not know. They did not know that their dark houses would be excavated by archaeologists 2,000 years later. They did not know that the names of their fishermen neighbors would be spoken in every language on earth. They did not know that the synagogue where they gathered on Sabbaths would become one of the most visited sites in the Middle East. They did not know that the lake where they fished at night, floating above 43 meters of dark water, trembling with cold and fear when the winds descended without warning, would be called a sacred sea. They lived. They fished. They paid taxes they could barely bear. They buried children they could not save. They mended nets. They ground grain. They lit their single-wick oil lamps against the darkness of houses without windows. And at some point, between one night's fishing and the next, between one Sabbath and the following, something happened in that village that split time into before and after. It was not the basalt stones that made Capernaum endure, not the white limestone synagogue, not the excavated foundations. What remains of Capernaum is not in the ruins. It is in the fact that a fisherman with no formal education, living in a house without windows, in a village of no political consequence, 210 meters below sea level, heard a voice on the shore of the lake and decided that it was worth more than everything he had ever known. And 2,000 years later, the whole world is still trying to understand what he heard.